In the 1940s, the Nazis marched victoriously across Europe and sunk their teeth into the Soviet Union. But the Soviet subject turned out to be stronger than the fascist teeth. The Germans were stuck in the Kuban, where they were bombarded from the air from all sides. The command was in despair, and only Corporal Steiner did not know defeat. He was an experienced soldier and performed extremely difficult tasks, for which he received special treatment. The commanders turned a blind eye to some of his antics. While the officers were hiding in the fortifications under fire from Soviet soldiers, Steiner and his team went to neutralize the mortar position. They killed everyone who was inside. Only the boy survives and is captured. At this moment, Captain Stransky arrives at headquarters. He voluntarily moved from France to Kuban to command Steiner's battalion. The regiment commander, Colonel Brandt, is perplexed why an officer like Stransky risks being transferred from relatively prosperous Europe to the east. The captain admits that he longs to receive the Iron Cross as a reward. As he leaves the fortification, a mortar attack begins, and Stransky realizes that his last name can now be read without the letter T. However, he quickly gains courage and, seeing Steiner returning, orders him to kill the captive boy. You know as well as I that there was an order not to take prisoners. The corporal refuses. Then Stransky decided to do it himself. One of Steiner's fighters says he will take care of the boy. The prisoner was hidden in a bunker, fed and left to live with Steiner's soldiers. The corporal himself believes the boy. He even leaves his weapon unattended next to him. Having rested, he goes to Stransky with a report on his exit. The captain reveals that he has promoted Steiner to sergeant. However, this is not at all impressive. Realizing that Steiner is not ready to obey him, Stransky tries to bend him. But here too he encounters serious resistance. He releases the sergeant and decides to keep an eye on him. One of the soldiers in Steiner's battalion has a birthday. Military personnel begin to celebrate this event, but not everyone likes such fun. An experienced fighter is having a nervous breakdown and needs to be calmed down. Meanwhile, Captain Stransky notices two people in his environment who like to touch each other with different parts of their bodies. His adjutant and Lieutenant Trebeck treat each other affectionately. Stransky decides to bring them to light. He also poses as an unconventional captain and forces the lieutenant to admit his destructive tendencies. He then promises to hang them both if he ever catches them in debauchery. Steiner understands that the Russians will soon go on the offensive and the captured boy will have a hard time. Therefore, he takes him out of the German positions and sends him to his own. As the prisoner leaves, an enemy appears from the fog. The soldiers open fire and kill the boy. The attack begins and the Nazis are torn apart. Steiner and his fighters miraculously remain unharmed. They fight without sparing themselves. At this moment, Captain Stransky is hiding in his bunker under the table. He is in a panic, afraid that his enemies will finish him off. And while Stransky cowardly hides in a shelter, Steiner is injured and ends up in a hospital. There were hallucinations here. One day, he even ran away and climbed into the lake. The nurse had to get into the water to pull him out. One day, dignitaries came to the hospital to examine the wounded and give orders. Doctors were ordered to treat a certain percentage of the military personnel so that they could be returned to the front as quickly as possible. The commanders also ordered that the wounded be well fed. Seeing the treat on the table, the soldiers pounced on them like animals and began to stuff their bellies. Only Steiner did not participate in this feast. He took a bottle of wine and walked away from the others. A nurse joined him. Soon they began a relationship. When Steiner was almost recovered, he met one of his own in the hospital. He returned to the front in Russia. Hearing about this, Steiner quickly packed his things and left with him. Seeing how he prepared, the nurse knew that the war was more important to this man than she and everything else. When Steiner returned to the front, he was joyfully greeted by old friends and colleagues. They had suffered greatly from the Soviet army, and their mood was bad. But the sergeant's return gave them hope. Upon learning that Steiner had arrived, Captain Stransky called him to his place. He orders a document to be signed confirming that Stransky was on the battlefield in the meat grinder where Steiner was wounded. This document has already been signed by Gadden and Trebeck. However, the sergeant refuses to sign. He did not see the captain in battle and is not ready to say otherwise, even for the sake of Stransky receiving the Iron Cross. While the captain and sergeant were talking, an air raid occurred. Realizing the planes were bombing his platoon's positions, Steiner rushed to his platoon. Then Colonel Brandt called Steiner to him. He wants to be honest about whether Sergeant Stransky saw him on the battlefield that day. Brand tries to punish the captain for his lies, but Steiner does not want to ruin the officer's career. Brand then calls Triebig. He claims that Stransky commanded the counterattack, but the soldiers interviewed unanimously claim the opposite. Therefore, Brand decided to file a complaint in a military court. However, in this case, Steiner must act as a witness. The sergeant is not ready to agree now. Meanwhile, Stransky was convinced that the Nazis would soon capture Crimea. But Brandt was informed that the Germans would have to retreat. Soviet soldiers defeated them. When Stransky was informed of this, he was ready to leave at any moment. The order was given to immediately evacuate all rearguard platoons. However, Captain Kiesel contacts him and orders him to wait for Steiner's platoon first. Only Stransky did not carry out the order. He decided to bury Steiner and his soldiers here and left without them. When the Russians attack, Steiner's platoon has to fight. They abandoned their positions under pressure from tanks and infantry. It was decided to leave through an abandoned factory. Here they were pinned down by Soviet soldiers and escape was difficult. However, Steiner and his soldiers managed to escape from the encirclement. Brandt understood that it was not easy for the sergeant now, even if he were alive. And he no longer thought that he would see Steiner again, but he turned out to be very persistent. He and the soldiers were in the rear. Upon reaching the river, Steiner and his soldiers notice a bridge and Russian soldiers on it. They silently approached the guards and stabbed them to death. Having crossed to the other bank, they approached a small post with a detachment of female soldiers. The Germans managed to capture them without a fight. The Nazis only required women to wear uniforms. They wanted to change clothes and go through the Russian positions to their own. However, the sight of women whom the Nazis had not seen for a very long time forced some soldiers to succumb to temptation. The Russians took advantage of this. One of the servicemen hinted to the German that he wouldn't mind having fun with him. And when he took her to the stable, she bit the pod at the root. At this moment, her friends kill the young soldier, who decides that he too will suffer. Sergeant Steiner was outside. Hearing the soldier's plaintive cry, he entered and saw that he was dying. Then screams were heard from a barn. Steiner did not punish the women. Instead, he let them deal with the podless soldier in their own way. Leaving him to be torn to pieces by the Russians, Steiner takes the others to his place. The plan was simple and reliable, like a Bavarian watch. Some soldiers will dress in Soviet army uniforms and march through Russian positions. Steiner would then send a coded message to the Germans that he was leading prisoners. This will allow them to return. At the same time, Brand contacted the command and agreed to transfer Kiesel to the rear. Captain Kiesel was exhausted from the war. He was in deep despair, and Brand decided to take care of him in this way. Kiesel tried to protest, but still left the front. Meanwhile, the masked Germans bring Steiner in their arms to the Soviet soldiers and explain in broken Russian that they are prisoners. They refused to take prisoners, and when the Germans tried to get through, they were discovered and tried to shoot. But Steiner's people were prepared for such a turn of events. They shot Soviet soldiers and reached the radio station. Steiner ordered them to come up with a password to get through the German lines. He also asked to be informed that he was taking Russians prisoner. This was necessary so that they would not be hit on the road because some of his fighters were dressed in Soviet uniforms. Steiner's message was received by Captain Stransky. He did not allow the sergeant to approach his positions and ordered them all to be killed. Triebig agreed because his friendship with Stransky promised him a transfer to the rear. Leading his men to the neutral zone, Steiner ordered them to surrender their weapons. Those who were in Soviet uniform should not be armed, otherwise there is a risk of being killed. He then led the fighters forward, but they opened fire. Triebig is in command of the shooting. Steiner was able to break through. Finally, realizing that there was a sergeant in front of them, the machine gunner stopped firing. Steiner was allowed into the trench, where he took aim at Lieutenant Triebig. He immediately handed over Stransky, saying that he was only following orders. I have nothing to do with this. However, this recognition is not enough for Steiner. His soldiers died at the hands of his own soldiers, and Triebig will regret it. The sergeant shoots him on the spot, then pursues Stransky. The Russians were advancing. Colonel Brandt contacts Stransky and orders him to bring his men to help. But the captain refused to approach him. He himself was not in a better position. Meanwhile, Steiner walked across the battlefield and finally reached Stransky, although he didn't kill him. Instead, he offered to win the Iron Cross in battle. When Steiner turned away from the captain, he was tempted to shoot him in the back, but Stransky did not. Finally, he took his bells in his fist and went out onto the battlefield. Seeing her trembling, Captain Steiner laughed. And gradually his cheerful laughter becomes more and more crazy. And then the Soviet soldiers tore their asses.